Hello, my name is Don Battistoni, and I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Headwall Photonics. I'd like to start by saying that I hope everyone and their families are doing well in these very, very challenging times. Obviously, the world has changed over the last few months, and this pandemic has affected us in many, many ways that would have seemed unfathomable just a short time ago. Our daily lives have been transformed, and specifically in this context, we've had to adjust the way we communicate with and support our customers. This webinar is an example of those adjustments, and I'm confident you will find the material both interesting and informative. I would like to thank everyone for their participation today, the presenters for their time, effort, and most importantly, their expertise in developing their presentations, and the attendees for spending time to learn about the use of hyperspectral imaging for applications in art and antiquities. It is important for me to point out that while Headwall is sponsoring the event, and many of the images to be presented were taken with our cameras, others were not, and there is no explicit endorsement of Headwall's products by our guest speakers. With that, I will pass the baton to Francesco Beccari for a review of today's agenda and introductions of our esteemed guest presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to our speakers for being here today. Somebody told me that we have two superstars of cultural heritage science with us today. So let me introduce them through the agenda we have today. The agenda will start with a lecture by Dr. John Delaney, a senior imaging scientist in the Scientific Research Department of the Conservation Division of the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. He will discuss examples of hyperspectral imaging at the NGA and other museums, including the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Following, we will have Dr. Greg Bearman, former researcher for the Jet Propulsion Lab, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and also a Headwall consultant. He will discuss his work with the Dead Sea Scrolls and other artwork. Finally, there will be me. I'm the European Sales Manager, and I will provide you a technology overview of hyperspectral imaging. So before I pass the ball to Dr. Delaney, I wish to give you a brief overview of Headwall. Later in my presentation, I will tell you about the technical stuff. So for the moment, I just wish to introduce you to Headwall in terms of where we are. Headwall is an American company, a global leader in hyperspectral imaging, located in Boston, Massachusetts. That's where we have our headquarters, home to sales, engineering, and system assembly. We have another very important facility in Massachusetts, in Fitchburg, where we produce our patented master quality holographic diffraction ratings. And finally, I introduce you to the Center for Hyperspectral Remote Sensing in Europe, a center that is there to support you users to implement the hyperspectral imaging technology for your specific application. So thanks for your attention. I wish to pass the baton to Dr. Delaney for his lecture. Thank you very much.
So today I'm going to speak about trimodal imaging spectroscopy of paintings. This is going to cover work that we've done at the National Gallery of Art as well as other museums. And the work I'm going to show today has been previously published. And I give citations to the papers for those of you who want to dig in a bit deeper. Now, the outline today will start off by reviewing the three imaging modalities. And then we'll talk about applications, probably the most interesting part. The first is reflectance imaging spectroscopy, which is really the heart of the presentation. We use this acronym RIS. The second is molecular fluorescence imaging spectroscopy, same sort of thing, but now we're looking at fluorescence. And then I'm going to talk briefly about elemental fluorescence, although it's not really the subject of today's talk. Elemental fluorescence or X-ray fluorescence has become an important adjunct or related imaging modality to help complete the picture, to understand materials and understand the composition of paintings. The applications we're going to look at include the straightforward one, artist material identification and mapping. The second, perhaps the most interesting, intriguing in the future, will be the visualization of artists' working methods to try to support art historians and conservators in their never-ending attempt to understand how an individual artist works and their working methods differ from others. And lastly, the most kind of fun thing for everybody, especially the public, is how we can go after looking for hidden changes in paintings. So a few definitions right off front. Unfortunately, our field is made up of a very diverse community, people who are chemists, and people who are physicists, and some people in between like myself. The region that we're going to talk about today is the visible through the near IR and sphere. That's the spectral range from 400 nanometers out to 2,500 nanometers. And I'm going to stick with the acronym is most familiar in remote sensing and among physicists. And I apologize to my chemist friends who prefer to live in the world of wave numbers. And I've given a conversion for 2,500 nanometers, 4,000 wave numbers to give you an idea where we're ending in the infrared. Now there's rich information out in the mid and long wave. That's the fundamental region, the fingerprint region, and there are cameras that work in that range, and some of us have been playing around there. And of course, the X-ray region for the elemental mapping. Okay, reflectance imaging spectroscopy, or otherwise known as hyperspectral imaging. In its simplest form, it's the collection of images in a sufficient number of contiguous spectral bands to allow generating the reflectance spectrum at each pixel within the spatial image. And I hope you can see my mouse here pointing to the image here, and this is the spectral dimension. Now, essentially what we're looking at is diffuse, scattered, and reflected light. Light from a lamp goes into the paint layer, shown here in cross-section where we see the pigment particles embedded in a binder. It rattles around, it scatters, some of it is light goes through the pigment particles, partially absorbed, and then it is emitted and is collected by the sensor. The definition of reflectance is the ratio of the irradiance out to the irradiance in. So in a real hyperspectral camera, you'd actually convert your camera to measure spectral radiance per se. In this case, we use a cheat. We measure the light coming off of a diffuse white panel, known reflectance, and we measure the light coming off of the painting, and we take the ratio. So we're working in apparent reflectance. Okay, so what do you get out of this? So you can take a pixel in the data cube, such as where the red arrow is showing here, and that spatial pixel, you can pull out the information and mine it in depth and wavelength and end up with a reflection spectrum. So this is the amount of light that's reflected back versus wavelength. And this spectral signature, as a geophysicist had made great use of, encodes information about electronic transitions, as well as information about vibrational features associated with the structure of the molecule. In this case, we're looking at azurite as characteristic absorbance features, and then it has a hydroxyl group, an overtone combination band, hydroxyl, and similarly for hydroxyl and carbonate further out. These signatures are very important for the assignment of azurite. The black line is from an area close to Christ, this blue up here. This is a characteristic spectral signature of ultramarine. In this case, natural ultramarine derived from lapis. And these electronic and vibrational features then become the key thing we're looking at for doing the identification of the pigments. Now, we can take these N-member spectra, or in this case, we define N-member spectra is out of the millions of spectra we collect, what are the most characteristic spectra that are unique and kind of define the N-members of the cloud of the data points. And then we can take these N-member spectra and we can make maps by essentially just querying the dataset cube. And we look for spatial pixels whose spectra match these of the N-member spectra. So we're going to look for natural ultramarine, azurite, out of the data cube using these spectral N-members and using the spectral angle mapper, an algorithm to do that. And here's the distribution that results. The green here is where we find azurite. It's in the floor, and it's in the border around this illuminated manuscript. You notice that the ultramarine is up here along Christ. What's interesting is this sort of reddish color here. When we pull a spectrum from that area, we get this curve. This curve shows the features of azurite plus this transition edge where the pigment's becoming reflective, similar to that of ultramarine. And this is a classic case of where right around Christ, a layer of ultramarine has been painted on top of azurite. Azurite is a very expensive mineral at this time period, pigment at this time period, and it would have been used for Christ, for example, on Christ, and then to highlight around Christ. So you can see the advantages of taking these end members, squaring the cube, and making these very useful maps. The other modality we're going to talk about is molecular fluorescence imaging spectroscopy. We're all familiar with all sorts of organic dyes that when you shine blue light on them, that they fluoresce. Really what we're looking at is optical emission from molecules that have been excited to a higher energy level through the absorption of electromagnetic radiation. Now in our case, we're going to be looking at later on eosine, a pigment used by Van Gogh for his paintings. And it's a very commonly known pigment and quite fugitive, unfortunately. It absorbs green light and emits red light. So we're going to promote an electron up, and one of the pathways for decay to the ground state is for the emission of the of light. In this case, shifted to the red. Now we're going to pay attention to the emission spectrum relative to the absorbance spectrum, and this shows the relationship between the two. The emission spectrum is a mirror image of the absorbance spectrum, and so it has similar characteristics. And we're going to be looking at features like the shoulder here to help in the identification. Now, the way we actually do this is relatively simple. We use the same hyperspectral setup, except that we're going to excite with light in the UV or blue-green region, and then we're going to have a filter that blocks the excitation light to allow us just to collect the emission light. This is a small color image of a detail from a La Mousme by Van Gogh in the collection in the National Gallery. And I'm showing you the emission spectrum from a region here by the sort of slightly pinkish flowers. This area is cut off, blocked by our filter because this is excitation. And then this is the emission spectrum that we obtain. Now this molecular fluorescence allows us a unique way to look at electronic excitations. And we can look at both organic and inorganic materials. And it allows us to look at pigments who don't have anything characteristic in the reflection spectra. They're simple reflectance spectra that don't make it so easy to identify. And these are typical for quite often for many reds and yellows. Lastly, in passing, I'll mention elemental X-ray fluorescence imaging spectroscopy. In this case, we're exciting the material with X-ray radiation. X-ray radiation causes secondary X-ray emission, and this emission is characteristic of the element. And I'm showing the data cube for such a cube collected with a hyperspectral scanner or an XRF scanner, macro XRF scanner. And you can see one thing, it's much longer, the energy range is larger, but you notice that the discreteness, it's not contiguous here. And if I pull out a spectrum from the floor, where we had azurite, azurite primarily is made up in part by copper. And you notice we end up with this very nice spectrum, emission spectrum, XRF spectrum, where we get these sharp features associated with copper. And I have to say I'm jealous of people who do XRF because they don't have a lot of overlap in their emission spectra. They're nice and narrow, and they know where they are. You can integrate the area underneath this curve and, of course, make an elemental map. This is a copper map, which, no surprise, aligns with azurite. One of the problems is you're only getting the elemental information. Many pigments have similar elements, so you can only infer the pigment. Okay, let's turn and actually look at some of the instrumentation that we're using at the National Gallery of Art. We have the macro XRF scanner. It's a single pixel scanner here that's home built. Again, this provides elemental information. And then we have two hyperspectral cameras, a Vernier camera, which operates from 400 to 1,000 nanometers, and then the SWIR camera, 1,000 to 2,500 nanometers. And they provide molecular information. And then we can, by using fluorescence, by using an excitation source and a blocking filter, turn our hyperspectral Vernier camera into a hyperspectral fluorescence camera. Now, for the hardcore aficionados, these are the specifications of our instruments, and they're quite similar to many instruments that are available these days. There are two things that I'd like to point out to you. The first thing is the time it takes to collect these data sets. In the case of the XRF scanner, since I have 1 pixel, the scan time is very long. To scan a 1 meter square painting at a spatial sampling of 1 millimeter takes 12 hours for a 40 millisecond integration time. Now, it's true in a museum, no painting is going anywhere fast, but curators want to keep paintings on the wall, and if someone travels from afar and wants to see that painting and it's not on the wall, they will get a note. In the case of the hyperspectral imaging systems, because we have, in this case, 1,000 pixels along the slit of the spectrometer, our collection efficiency is much higher. And to cover the same area, the same spatial resolution, only takes 5 minutes. There's one other caveat that I would note. A lot of hyperspectral camera systems are designed to work outside. The measure of light level in the museum setting is typically used as lux. It is a visible measurement, but it's still relevant for our case. Outside environment, it's typically tens of thousands of lux, where a lot of these cameras were designed to operate. In the museum environment, we're asked to examine paintings at 2,000 lux or below. Well, to give you a feeling, your average office is probably about 500 to 700 lux. The average museum is lit for about 300 lux. So it means that we have to spend a little more time in making sure we have very sensitive detectors and not be too hasty at our collection rates. Now, there are many things to move to collect up a hyperspectral data set. Pretty much all the cameras that people use these days involve translating the hyperspectral camera relative to the artwork or any object you want to image in order to build up the image cube. You can do this by moving the camera, or you can do it by moving the artwork. Because we're kind of in the business of trying out different hyperspectral systems and developing new ones, we have a setup that allows us to move the artwork and trigger the hyperspectral camera or any camera in order to collect the data sets. Okay, so what do you do with all this data? Well, I suppose with a few million spectra, even if you had 10 graduate students, you're not going to get out of paper anytime soon. So you have to find some way to compress this data set down to a basis set of what we call n-member spectra that describe the entire art object. And there are a lot of multivariant techniques to do that. I'm going to show you an example here of the type of things we've been able to do with paintings. This example here is a painting by the master of the Dominican effigies. Basically what we're saying, I understand, is we don't know exactly the individual, but we know the characteristics of this particular painter. And this is Christ enthroned with 40 saints. And it's a leaf from a choir book from 1340, a very famous book called the Ladaro. And you're seeing Christ and Mary and all the saints below. Well, there's a very popular algorithm in a remote sensing package developed by, that currently is managed by Harris Corporation called ENVI. And the algorithm is a spectral hourglass wizard. And it's a pretty detailed process. It's manual, takes several hours to run. It helps if you've done this a bunch of times. But it allows you to reduce the dimensionality of the data and then collect through clustering a set of n members which well describe the object. And here I'm showing you the number of n members here that we were able to obtain using this algorithm. Now, you can see that we have assigned pigments to these particular areas that we've classified. I should note that really what we're saying is the end members are reflectance spectra, and then we look at the reflectance spectra, and then we, from that and other information, infer what the composition is. And we've done a pretty good job and got pretty much everything, but not absolutely everything. Now, this again took several hours to run, and actually I would have to say a couple bites at the apple. We've been working with researchers at the Center for Imaging Science at RIT to make use of state-of-the-art algorithms, such as MAXD, along with the spectral angle mapper, to more directly, automatically, and more statistically significantly obtain the end members. This particular result here, obtained by my colleague at RIT, was done in a few minutes. So you're going from several hours, maybe over a couple attempts over days, to a few minutes. So there's some hope here that we can speed up the process of getting spectra and not require a super expert user. Now the question comes up, is the VNIR spectrum sufficient to ID pigments? And here I'm showing you a illuminated manuscript by Vani, St. Peter Enthroned. This particular illuminated manuscript, we've been able to, with a VNIR cube, classify it using the traditional NV method. I'm showing you the first derivative spectra, which we're finding to be more useful than the reflectance. So it's a derivative of the reflectance with respect to wavelength. But what I want to say is, it depends on the pigment as to whether you can identify simply by the reflectance spectra. Certain blue pigments you can, some iron oxides you can do that. But we and other groups have found that if you classify the picture into end members that allow you to define regions, and then go back and do point analysis, non-invasive point analysis, such as X-ray fluorescence or reflectance spectroscopy, but done from, say, 350 nanometers all the way out to 250 nanometers, 2,500 nanometers, or maybe even Raman, you can then go ahead and more carefully and accurately assign the pigments that are present in these areas that have been classified based on the reflection spectra. So again, it depends on the pigment whether you can do it directly, but most of us are combining other modalities to come up with the answers. Okay, so I'll talk about a couple of examples where we have studied, in this case, a panel painting, and extended into the infrared further, into the SWIR, to improve our ability to identify pigments. And I'll show you a few things we've been able to pull out. This is a panel painting by Cosmo Tora. It's of the Virgin. And we collected data from 420 nanometers out to 1,683 using 2 hyperspectral cameras and merged the data sets together. We did our processing and ended up with a series of end members, which we identified as a red lake, ultramarine that's light and dark, really the amount of lead white present, cobalt blue, which would be a restoration pigment for inpainting, azurite, and iron oxides, and something we later turned out was a copper resonate. Now with the end members, we can make this map. Map tells us right away that azurite was used for the background, and that Mary's robe consists of 2 forms of ultramarine, some with more and less lead white. We can also see that the red of her dress, let's just say to keep it simple, consists of a red lake. The hair contains a yellow ochre. Well, the ochre is really earth derived, so I probably should say that it's a yellow earth. And there's lead white in the flesh we can show as well. The yellow is actually in painting. These are areas that were lost, a paint that was lost over time, that a conservator has in painted, fully removable, to make sure that your eye is not distracted by the losses. Now, another thing that people are always interested in getting is as much information about the preliminary sketch. An artist at this time period would sketch out the design on top of a gypsum white background with a infrared absorbing material, either a liquid carbon black or bone black, or maybe some sort of dried implement, a crayon or something, a chalk. And when you look at this false color image here from the infrared, you can see there's a lot going on here. There are places where we see color, which are partially penetrated paints. We can see things that do look like drawing that are sort of dark brownish. This is some of the in-painted areas. Got some strange stuff going on here, bit in the background. Well, if we use the reflectance spectra and actually take the one associated with what we think is drawing and use that to make a map, we end up with the following picture. And this is a much clearer and probably more accurate visualization of the underdrawing extracted directly from the data cube. And this again is another useful feature of the hyperspectral data set. It may not tell us exactly what the pigment for the underdrawing is, but it allows an improved visualization for the art historian and conservator to work with. So again, this is the initial preparatory sketch the artist starts with. Well, what happens if we go all the way out to the region beyond 1800 nanometer, or beyond 1700 nanometers? Well, there are vibrational overtone features that are associated with the binding media that's holding the pigments in place. And the binding media changes over time. We go from things like tempera, water-based materials, that would be egg yolk, animal skin glue, to much later periods to obviously oil paints, and then to more modern materials such as acrylics and alkyds. And one of the things that has been a challenge is trying to make maps on the macro scale of these materials. Now, there are excellent analytical tools to identify all of these pigments in the stratigraphy by taking micro samples and using modern biochemical and analytical chemistry techniques. So, but you can't sample anywhere you want. And the power of these tools, of course, is to look everywhere. So we've spent time, and recently others as well, looking to see if we could make use of these weak overtone features in the region beyond 1700 nanometers, in particular 2300 nanometers. And for egg yolk and for these fatty acid containing binders, like drying oils, it's this set of pigments here at 2309, 2304, 2312 that become important. Animal skin glue, it's these amide groups here. But we always have to imagine that we're sitting on top of a gypsum ground and we penetrate in the sphere all the way through the paint layers, and so we always get this combination. Well, when we studied the panel painting, we found these characteristic end members. We found one with a feature here at 2310. This is indicative of that of egg yolk, and the others we found were indicative of a protein. Well, again, we can use the end members, make a map. And to keep it simple, this is a map of the binders as we understand them. What drops out of this is a very simple story. Egg yolk binder was used in the areas for the to map the red dress, the face, which consists of lead white and that ochre, the hair, which has ochre and some lead white, and also the landscape. Now, the blue materials were not mixed with the egg yolk, which is yellow and might shift the color, but are actually painted out with a protein, with a glue, proteinous glue. And we see that for the azurite, and we see that for the ultramarine blue of the robe. And these are characteristic, what I understand to be characteristic ways people painted around this period of time. Now I'd like to really switch gears on you and look back at a more challenging problem. The challenging problem is associated with Vincent van Gogh and his paintings, many of which have faded over time, specifically with the fugitive red pigments. We mentioned Eocene earlier. One of the great things about Van Gogh's paintings is that he used quite a bit of documentation through letters to his brother Theo about the pigments that he ordered, when he ordered them, and also about the colors and sometimes even the pigments that he used in the paintings that he was making. So in a letter to Theo, written in 1889, he writes about working on paintings involving women picking olives. And he notes the colors that he achieves. He says the field is violet. He also notes that the sky is entirely pink and the three small figures are pink as well. We know from the letters at this time period that he was ordering some pigments that contained eosine and also carminic acid. This is a painting at the National Gallery, the Olive Orchard, in which we have the two women. And you can notice that the pinks don't quite sound as vibrant, don't seem to be as vibrant as the description by Van Gogh. And this is due to the fading of these fugitive reds. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because, besides the notes, we know that because if you look at the edge of the painting, which has been covered up by the frame, you can see these sort of pinkish purplish colors that are present. And also early lithographs convince you that this colorant was there. So we took on as a challenge, could we find a new imaging modality to ID and map these residual red-like pigments, such as eosine? So basically, a lot of them are faded and degraded, but the idea is some of them are probably still intact, and if we have a very sensitive method, perhaps we can find them. Well, fluorescence is an extremely sensitive method to look for small amounts of molecules, heavily used in bioassays in the medical field these days. And eosine actually used as a biological stain. Here's the molecule. It says bromine, 4 bromine groups on it. And this is eosine mixed in with lead white at the 1% level per mass. And you can see this beautiful, pink color. This is the characteristic fluorescence emission spectrum that we can get from our setup from these test panels, showing a peak here and then this series of shoulders that will become important for the diagnosis understanding. Now, we only looked for this case at a small region of the painting. And I show the detail here of the color image. And then I show you a false fluorescence image collected after exciting with blue-green light. And right away, you can see all sorts of reddish-looking fluorescence and whitish-looking fluorescence. It's very tricky from such a false color image alone to assign what's eosine and what's carminic acid. And to really do that, we think you need to look at the fluorescence emission spectra. Fortunately, we use a hyperspectral imaging system. You got to look at that emission spectra. And we found, especially my colleague, Kay Tooley, that by looking at the first derivative, we get a much better handle on the spectral features, in particular the shoulder at 668 nanometers. And all I want to show here is these are the end members we obtained. And focusing on this feature here shows that we believe there's some eosine present. And then we can show where it's mapped to. We see that on the blouse, especially in the region around the breast of the woman, there is presence of some eosine. We also notice that there's eosine actually in some of the tree trunks in the scene as well. And the really cool thing is there's some evidence for eosine in the outline of the woman's hair and her ponytail. If we look at a detail of the current painting, you can see this rather blackish pigment used to outline the hair here. This turns out to actually be, by reflectance imaging, we know is Prussian blue, pigment that he often used in this way. But he often put eosine on top of the Prussian blue to give it a purplish-like character. So our fluorescence information is telling us that on top of this, at one time, there was a much stronger and brighter Eocene present. Okay, so I'd like to move on and talk about something that has appeared in the news recently. It's analysis done by a very large group of international researchers on the girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer. There were a whole variety of questions that were addressed and some really excellent research papers published. All of this was organized by the Maritz House. And one of the questions that we were given was, could we use hyperspectral reflectance imaging to try to get a list of, to try to get at where the pigments are used in the painting. Now, through micro cross-sectional analysis, they had a pretty darn good idea of what pigments he used. But they were hoping we could give more insight into where the distribution of these pigments were. The same challenge was given to a group doing macro XRF and to another group doing macro diffraction. So here's the painting, which many people are familiar with. And I'm showing the first result, which is focused on looking at her blue turban. The reflectance spectra, the end member that we got, all have this characteristic high reflectance for blue, and then a very strong absorbance centered around 600 nanometers. This is the characteristic spectral feature of ultramarine. You can also see in the reflectance spectra, which extends out beyond 1600 nanometers, a absorbance at 1446. This is associated with the absorbance of basic lead white. And we see that this green end member, which is a relatively higher reflectance than the others, occurs in an area where we see a lot of light bluer color. And that, when you look at the elemental maps, correlates and overlaps with lead. Lead here likely being from lead white. So this is a region, there's a fair amount of lead white mixed in with the ultramarine. As you go into the darker areas here, bluer becomes more intense. You can see that in terms of the shifting down the reflectance curve. And we see quite a bit of it, of ultramarine, and that corresponds nicely with the decrease in the lead. You'll also notice that the potassium map from the elemental mapping shows that the potassium. Well, the reason why we're seeing potassium in ultramarine is associated with the way the lapis is processed, the stone, to extract and make the natural ultramarine. We end up with some residual potassium. So this sort of all plays together nicely, and it shows the complementarity of the hyperspectral reflectance along with the elemental mapping. Okay, so that answers the blue turban question, ultramarine with various amounts of lead white. Well, then there's kind of this sort of interesting color of her jacket, which has this sort of slightly greenish, bluish, yellow color. Well, we end up with end members that are very characteristic of an ochre. It has absorbance features that make it a yellow ochre. At 534 is this inflection. You have an absorbance here, another absorbance around 660, and then an important one at 950. This is all characteristics of the mineral goethite and allows us to make a pretty clear assignment. Now, this ochre, yellow ochre, is derived from mining. And so it's more proper to refer it as a yellow earth. Now, what's going on here to create the sort of green to more slightly blue areas, which we're showing in these colors here? So the blue, we start to see absorbance at 600 nanometers. So that's interpreted as the presence of ultramarine of increasing amounts to shift the color towards this green-blue. And that matches up well with the XRF elemental maps. We see most of the potassium on the backside, and of course, in the iron maps, we see correlation where we see the iron oxides. So this all sort of lays well together, and the cross-sectional samples also agree that this is essentially what's present, is the use of these two materials to make up the jacket. On the face, it's a little more tricky because you have mixed pigments. We're using the derivative data cube. For the face, we find regions that are strong in vermilion, which is here in the false color image. You can see here in the sort of reddish areas. Let's just skip to the map. These maps are made with a derivative reflectance spectra. This particular shape here corresponds to a simple S-shaped reflectance curve. That's vermilion. It's on the lit side of her face, strong in her lips. And that's consistent with the mercury map, where mercury, which would be one of the elements for vermilion, shows up to a lesser extent on the sides of her face, but definitely strongly in the lips. The iron map is consistent where we're finding yellow ochre here on this portion of the face, and then sort of in the more shadow regions, we're finding the ochre with less lead white down here in the shadow regions. So again, the use of vermilion, ochres, and different amounts of lead white to paint the face. So mapping the red lake. So it's not uncommon, besides just using vermilion to create the reds, to add some red lake. In this case, probably not eosine, but actually cochineal to create the effect. Now, the way we go after that is to make use of the fluorescence properties of this particular pigment. It fluoresces. Use blue-green excitation would be ideal. But when this experiment we started off was saying, well, what if we just use UV? I'm showing the emission spectra versus wavelength. First, for this blue is the emission spectra we're getting with a UV excitation. You can see we get emission with a peak, which is characteristic of the red lake. But you notice we get a lot of other component here. It's not just a pure spectrum of just coming up and going down. That's associated with the fact that with the UV excitation, we're exciting a lot of other materials, the white pigments, degradation products that fluoresce. If we excite optimally, where the absorbance of the red pigment should be, the red lake, in the green and blue, you end up with this red curve for the lips and this for the from her cheek, this sort of pinkish curve here. And you can see the importance of optimizing your excitation for doing fluorescence to excite the molecule or pigment you're most interested in. And again, one can make maps, and one can see the use of this red lake in the cheeks, and of course, the heavy use of it in the lips. And as expected in the macro XRF maps, you can see the presence of potassium here in the lips, consistent with the presence of a lake. Now I'd like to go on and talk more about essentially what you can do in the infrared to answer questions about paintings underneath paintings. And this is kind of a little bit of a detective story, and this was driven by questions from an art historian. The gallery, we have this painting, which is attributed to Fragonard, or known to be from Fragonard, Young Girl Reading. It's a very well-liked painting. And you can see this woman, a young woman, is sitting in solitude reading her book. It's thought to be associated with the fantasy figures by Fragonard because of the color and the way it's painted. But on all of these fantasy figures, you can see, well, everyone's in fantasy costume, but they're all looking out towards the viewer, making, or at least partially outwards. Whereas this is sort of a very quiet, sort of more genre scene. These are completely different. And this has sort of bothered art historians, because if this is really a fantasy figure by Fragonard, we should see the woman looking out in part to us. Well, some years ago, a very interesting discovery was made that there was a series of drawings that showed up that showed a lot of the fantasy figures. There are sort of thumbnail sketches here. And there is one, the first in the series, that shows a woman, which looks like a woman reading a book, but looking out towards us. Well, that's quite exciting. If our painting was originally had a woman looking out towards us, that would be great. Well, in the 1980s, an X-ray was taken of the painting. And the X-ray shows that there's a face looking out. The problem is the face is not exactly clear whether that's a man or a woman. And at that time period, people were leaning that we probably had a man looking out towards us. So we were asked to relook and see if there was any evidence to say it's a woman and not a man. This is the sketches of the other fantasy figures. This is the first one we're talking about. So we did hyperspectral imaging in the SWIR and made a false color composite. And if you stare at this image for a moment, you can see two things. You can see a ghostly image of the young woman's face now, but underneath you can see emerging the face of a woman. Now blowing it up, you can see her lips. There's one eye, other eyes here, a little covered up, and you can see this black tie around her neck. And so this is much more convincing that our sitter is a woman, and the rest of the painting is unchanged. So only the head has been modified. And therefore this sits nicely with the sketch. It sort of closes the loop that the original painting was part of the fantasy series, and that Fragonard had changed this at some point in time. And there's more to this story, which I suggest you read the article, but I'll leave it at that for time. I'd like to kind of finish up here with some studies that we've done on a very large painting, Feast of the Gods. This painting is a complicated history. It was started by Bellini and finished by Titian. The scenes show the gods down here in the foreground, but the interest we're focused in is on this big hillside in the background. You see there's a stand of trees here, and this hillside has complicated history. Now, this painting underwent extensive studies in the late 1980s by both X-ray, broadband infrared, and then the taking of quite a few micro cross-sectional samples that were fully analyzed that worked out a pretty good complete story for what happened to this painting. The story comes up and says that Bellini, who started the painting, finished it as the gods against a forest of trees, no hillside. And this is a schematic of what that would have looked like. Somewhere along the way, a hillside was painted in the background. This hillside is attributed to Dasso, and you'll see some evidence for that in a moment. And then later, that hillside was revised by Titian. And that's how we see the composition today. So one of the questions we were asked is, could we try to get a better understanding of what the original painting looked like when Bellini finished it with a stand of trees? Well, if you look at, again, a false color image using the SWIR, we're able to penetrate the paint layers, you can see very nicely the stand of trees running all the way across. And more importantly, unlike what you can see in the X-ray, you can see these trees continue all the way to the top of the image, and that was important. Now, using the reflected images, we also took transmitted, so light going through the actual canvas and collected in the infrared as well. And combining all of that information along with the X-ray, and then insights from a painting conservator familiar with the painting techniques of Bellini at this time period, Becca Goodman was able in Photoshop to put together this recreation, or simulation, I really should say, of what the composition probably looked like when Bellini finished it. And as you can see, it's a very different type of scene compared to that of the hillside. And I'm afraid you're going to have to read David Allen's book to find out why these changes were made. Well, if we go back, you can see there's a funky little tree here that doesn't look proper. It doesn't look like it belonged to this large stand. This is another false color image in the infrared. This is the area of the painting that's as it seems today when Titian's finished. And you can see that the nature and shape of these leaves are very distinctive. It was the infrared image in X-ray that showed this tree, which I have to say is much clearer in the false color here, that gave evidence to suggest the intermediate painter was Dossi. And the example given is this painting in the collection of the gallery, which shows the way in which Dasso characteristically painted these trees. Okay, so there's more work here, but we haven't published it yet about an intermediate landscape. So where we are today. Currently, we're assisting a very large project at the Rijksmuseum. It's a study of the night watch being imaged with every modality you can think about. The painting is huge. It's 3.6 by 4.4 meters. It's a painting well known by everybody. Currently, the hyperspectral veneer imaging of the entire painting at 0.18 millimeters spatial sampling has been completed. Here's an example of the work being done and the lights used to illuminate the painting and scanning to do this in the dark. This work is being led by Francesca, who you can see here operating the system, and she was a former postdoc in the department at the scientific department at the National Gallery of Art, who learned hyperspectral imaging from us, and we're assisting with the SQUID data collection. So that work is basically finished up recently, and now they're moved on to do the data collection of the SWIR. And first, I want to note how small and relatively cute the hyperspectral SWIR camera is. It's illumination lights. This is a view from the front, and this is the setup as it is on the scanning apparatus for the easel. So this brings me to the end of my talk. We have many collaborators to thank, both inside the gallery and outside. And I want to thank the organizers here for allowing me to present the data today.
So this is Greg Bearman speaking, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And a lot of the work I'm going to talk about is looking at text, and I'm going to talk about specifically about the Dead Sea Scrolls because I've worked a lot with them. And then we're going to segue from that with some of those ideas that we did for imaging and text to ways to think about using spectral imaging and spectroscopies as technologies for looking for conservation purposes, for changes and things. And so like John, this is some previously reported work. It's also a collaboration. And there was myself, and there was a group at the University of Eastern Piedmont in Italy, Marcello Manfredi. This was part of his PhD work. And we also work with the Library of Congress for some, we did some artificial aging with them, and then also the Israeli Antiquities Authority. So if you, the history of this and also mine of working in the field is that the main people who were interested in looking at text was they were interested in the content. And they wanted to be able to read text that had been damaged or faded or in palimpsests. And the people driving this were text scholars because they were Hebraicists, they were classicists, and they wanted to see what it said. But there's another aspect to this, which is looking at changes in this. So as we all know, entropy always wins. And there's a lot of damages to both parchment and papers and inks and pigments over time. There's material loss and there's pigment, they fade and they bleach. There's a lot of substrate issues. With parchment, for example, it turns to jello. I am going to give an example from looking at stone and statues. We're looking at biofilms using spectroscopy, and stonework is also gets heavily damaged from the environment. So this is kind of the outline. So I'm going to talk with some examples from Dead Sea Scrolls in Ostraca, and then I'll show you how we decided to leverage that into looking at changes. So it was really known for a long time that if you had a text that was hard to read, an ancient text of some sort, but that if you took an infrared photo using infrared film, it often made it look better, but meaning more legible. Nobody really knew why or why it worked or why it sometimes it didn't work. So here's an example actually of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you'll see on the left I think this is an image somewhere in the blue-green part of the spectrum. And if you look at the right, there's an example where it's all very nice and clear. And the other thing I want to point out is that there's a piece of Scotch tape on here. This is left over from efforts in the mid to late 50s when it was called sellotape then. And they were using this to hold these fragments together and also to consolidate them. So here's an example where these two fragments belong together, and they're using it here to, you can see there's a big crack here. But the interesting thing, of course, is if you look over here, you can see there's part of a letter which is peeking out through the tape right here. And so and John pointed this also, right? So we're just reading right through the tape. It's simple organic material, and the light penetrates. Why does this infrared imaging work? And the answer is that what happens is that the parchment becomes more reflective in the infrared. So you get more contrast between the ink and the parchment. So simply put, if you have a text that's difficult to read because it all looks just basically dark, what's going on is that the ink, which is a carbon black ink and is basically, I'll show you in a minute, is just carbon. And the parchment they're both reflect about the same amount of light. So you get very little contrast and it's very difficult to read. And what we found out when we started doing spectroscopy and spectral imaging of these documents is that it's the contrast really that drives the legibility. And if you have a legible text, the ink and the parchment have very different reflectance and it's very easy to read. And if you have illegible text, ink and parchment have the same reflectance. So you really don't get much contrast and it's difficult to read. So here's an example of this. So here's on the left is a nice spectra from a legible fragment. This is the parchment. This is the ink reflectance. These are point spectra, but you see the same thing when you switch to doing imaging. And at the same time, here is a fragment which is difficult to read. And up through most of the visible, like right about here, for example, the ink and the parchment have roughly the same reflectance. So you don't really see very much. Now, I used to say that nobody really knew what was going on. So there's some surface chemistry obviously going on. But there's been a few papers recently that have suggested, they've done a lot of FTIR and Raman and other spectroscopies to really look at what's going on. And the suggestion is that what's making the parchment get dark is some kind of Maillard reaction. And actually it works for ostraca and papyrus as well. You have the same sort of things going on. Here is a 450 nanometer image from a papyrus up at UC Berkeley. Oops, this is doing things for me. And you can see there's text on there. I mean, I want you to make sure you understand that it doesn't look like it's blank, although sometimes it does. But you can see there's text on here. There's a line here and a line here. But it's really not very legible. But if you go to a 940 nanometer, it's really pretty legible. So this is another example of you have these contrast and spectral changes that significantly affect the visibility of the text. And this shows you the papyrus that I just showed you. So same thing here. So the blue is the ink. So down here in the part of the visible, which ends right here, they're really very similar. So there's very little contrast. And I also plotted the contrast ratio. And you see as you go further out in the infrared, it gets, the contrast increases. This is an ostracon. So ostracons are pottery sherds that have writing on them. And again, if you look at this thing, and I've handled all these myself, and you can look at it and say, yeah, there's something on there. But over here at 970, it's really quite legible. And there are examples, for example, of ostraca that were excavated, say, 20, 25 years ago, and people have really good, just plain black and white or color images of them. And if you look at them now, they're illegible. So there's some sort of, there's a lot of chemistries going on. It's most likely exposure to oxygen and light and humidity that's driving all this. So when we started working on this project, which was about 2008 or 9, I think, And really what happened was the genesis of this, the Antiquities Authority was really interested in conservation. They wanted to find a way to find out if the scrolls were actually changing. In other words, were the ones that were very legible in 1948, 1950, are they changing? And so the fact that there's this reflectance feature change, so what we thought was that we would use the reflectance spectrum as the monitoring method. So the idea is you're going to measure the reflectance spectrum before, and you're going to measure it 6 months later, and then you're going to compare them somehow. So what we really want to do is you want to detect changes before they become visible to the eye. So the before is really set by the imaging system performance, and this is really where we put a lot of work in on. So you obviously what you want is you want a good system, because if you have big errors, it doesn't really help you figure out if anything has changed if it's just on the same order of your measurement error. And the second point is something that John alluded to with his army of postdocs, which is that you really need to find a way to do this in some automated fashion. You need algorithms that will find a way to look at the total image cube and pixels, and then flag areas that the algorithm thinks have the spectrum has changed over time. There's just simply too much data for a human operator, and frankly, just looking at spectra really doesn't do you all that much good anyhow. So what we did was we didn't invent the method we use called Sheward control, but these are methodologies that are borrowed from quality and process control, and they were designed originally for people doing manufacturing pharmaceuticals. So at least for the needs of this particular project and application, what we needed was a really good quantitative spectral imaging system. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the end data we got, and then how we applied it to monitoring. And so the thing that the Antiquities Authority was most interested in was the monitoring. It turned out, of course, that we made what we did. We wound up imaging all of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, of which there are roughly 20,000. Most of them are not scrolls. I think we tend to think of a scroll as this long papyrus thing that you unravel and you roll it up to read it. There's only maybe a dozen or so that are that big. Most of them are fragments roughly the size of your hand. The other thing that they were interested in was looking at conservation time treatments. So they do repairs and restorations. So for example, they took all the sellotape off the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was a pretty monumental task. And the other thing we'd like to maybe do is measure rates of change if we have good quantitative data. And there's a lot of data in the literature on photo bleaching and other kinds of damage to fugitive pigments, for example, and paper and canvas and other things. But those are nearly all laboratory artificial aging experiments. So there's really nothing. I'm sorry, that's not fair. There's not very much data that looks at an actual cultural heritage objects over time. So the system I'm going to talk about a lot here, this is not a hyperspectral image with hundreds of bands. We wanted very large images and high resolution. So for the purposes of the scroll project, we used a 50 megapixel camera and LED illuminations to provide the spectral light. And there is some data here that is spectroscopy, and you'll see that when it shows up. So I was at JPL for 30 years, and JPL was very much interested in calibration and absolute reflectance for all of our spectral images and other cameras as well. So you see some of that reflected in here. This is just my bias. So how does this monitoring approach work if we do have the spectral data? So one of the things, so the way this works is you're going to image a fragment at some fixed increment, and the change is from fragment to fragment. We're not developing libraries or databases that show here's this set of spectral data, quantitative spectral data. We're going to compare, you'll see how we do this. We compare each fragment to itself. So we take a lot of data and we use this to measure the system noise and the uncertainty and the statistical noise that we have each pixel. So we measure before, and then we're going to set a threshold for changes, and then we're going to image a fragment at another time after, and we're just going to compare we have software that just trolls through it and tells you this changed within your statistical measurement or it did not. And you see how this all works out. All right, so one of the things we did, this is the work we did with the Library of Congress, is we took modern parchment, which was made according to, as near as we could tell, the rabbinic traditions for making parchment. Oops, it's going back. Oh, sorry, it's deciding that I'm done. And what we did was we aged it at the Library of Congress with a combination of humidity and temperature. And even, oh, it's hard to see. So even in a few hours of aging, this is 2 hours and this is 6 hours, you'll see that there were some changes in the parchment that our software picked up. So what we did was we aged it. We took a large number of pictures of this, of image cubes. We developed a statistical measure that says, okay, for each pixel, we measure the reflectance to this amount, and there's some uncertainty attached to that. And then when we take this and register the two images and look at the same pixels again, you can determine if there's been any changes in the reflectance spectrum. So some things kind of fall out of this while we were doing this, and this is also, again, related to the notion of what goes on over time. So on the left is a 1950s photograph of the parchment on the right, and you notice that you don't really see the parchment. All you see is you don't see the outline of the parchment of the fragment. All you see is the text. And the reason for this is that this is an infrared film on the left, and in the 50s they overexposed it because they were really only interested in the text itself, and they didn't care about the substrate. So that's why in a lot of the photos it's so overexposed that you really don't see it. So this is the same fragment and the same text. You'll have to take my word for that, but the text is indeed the same. And so one of the things that we were interested in and we realized was coming out of this work is, since we have all the 1950s photos, we can register the images again. And as we do that, parchment expands and contracts and it buckles, and it's got a lot of movement over time. And so what we can do is, so we're able to make a movie that that tracks the pixel motions over time, and you can see the parchment itself actually differentially moving. And that, by the way, is one of the sources of damage for any parchment. If you have areas that expand and contract differentially with respect to others, the parchment tears itself apart. And there's a lot of Dead Sea Scrolls where that is indeed happening. So let me see. So this is a movie, and what you'll see is that you'll see the infrared photo from the 50s, and then the new movie, the new image, and then it'll kind of twist and rotate as the registration algorithm is trying to align it. And we use SIFT for this. So the first thing it tries to do is to do just a simple rotation and translation, and then if it can't do that, it says, okay, I give up, and then we allow the parchment to deform, and then it does, and then it comes up with the final conclusion. So while it's doing all this, we're tracking the pixels to see where they go. So the thing we wind up with that just sort of fell out of doing all this imaging and registration was a map that showed how much this parchment had distorted itself over time. So now it's got okay, so it's rotating and it's trying to figure out how to do it. And then you'll see at some point it's just going to go scrunch. And there it goes. So that's it. So you see it had to significantly deform itself. And now we wind up with the modern image. So what we used for this particular piece of work was a 13-band LED illumination and I'm sorry, it was a 39 megapixel. No, this is wrong. It's a 49 megapixel camera. And we used a broadband lens. It's a macro lens that was color corrected. So we didn't have to refocus between bands, and everything was auto registered. So for the kind of work we were interested in, accuracy and precision were really kind of important. And our thought was that for monitoring purposes, precision is more important. I mean, as long as there's a systematic error, as long as it's not a crazy number, we were happy with that. And you'll see the kind of results we got out of this in a minute. So we did all the standard stuff. We measured the illumination with spectral line. We flat fielded. We did all the, we put color targets and spectral targets in the images. And so the idea was that if you do all this right and you set it up, it really doesn't make any difference how you do it. And one of the reasons it's important, at least for texts, is a lot of texts are in different institutions. There are many books or pieces of books or collections of texts that have been discovered over the decades that are, there's some in Berlin, and there's some in Cincinnati, and there's some in Israel, and there's some in New York. And if somebody wanted to figure out a way to actually make an integrated data set, you need to be able to go to these places and come back with really good calibrated data sets. So I just wanted to show you sort of what we got out of it. And this is looking at one of the standard reflections targets. These are NIST traceable. You can buy them from LabSphere. They're not inexpensive. And so you'll see that they're plotted on here. And certainly for down here, there's so little difference you really can't see it. It begins to separate a little bit out as you get out in the red. So I also plotted the ratio, which kind of blows it up a little bit. So you're seeing we're getting within roughly 5% of the absolute reflectance from the NIST targets, which is pretty good radiometry. As far as the precision goes, this is one of the custom gray targets, and it's taken a month apart. And so you see down here the actual data, and up here again, I plotted the ratio to kind of expand it. But the thing about this is that some of this data was taken in Goleta, and some of it was taken in Santa Barbara, and they were taken at different dates and different days, and in between, we took everything down, packed it up, drove down, set it up again, and took it all over, and retook all the data. So this is really what you need to sort of make all this stuff work. So I think most people know that when you do this multi-band or spectral imaging, that you can also convert it into very, very accurate color measurements. And depending on how you measure it, the delta E's are on the order of 1 or less. And you can also think of color as another way of monitoring what's going on. And in particular, for the age parchment, we get a delta E of 76 around 1, which is nominally considered less detectable, near the threshold of what's detectable by the eye. And so we really wanted to demonstrate that we can see these changes before they become apparent. In other words, for a lot of things, you don't need a fancy system. You just look at it and say, well, this thing is really a whole lot less legible than it was 2 years ago. So if you look at this way of thinking about it, about doing the monitoring, the question is really, well, what can go wrong? And we think that the business example of what can go wrong is image registration error. And I do not have the references for our publications on here, but I can give them to Ross, and he can put them up if people want them. But in there, we talk about that a lot. And it's really the image registration issues. And so think about it this way. So if you have an image queue from January, an image queue from June, and when you start to compare them, you've misregistered them. So, and you look at that pixel, it says, well, this spectrum is a lot different than it was 6 months ago. So there's something going on here. But so therefore, a misregistered pixel gets classified as a change pixel. And what we wound up doing actually was doing a lot of binning. So it sort of washes them out. And at the same time, and I had a hard time convincing some people of this, is that you didn't really want to look at all 49 million pixels, because if you get any one pixel can have noise, it could be an outlier. And if you bin it down, you still get, very good resolution, and it does a better job of minimizing registration errors. So this is an ongoing project with the Antiquities Authority right now, where they have the system in place, and I think they have finished imaging all of the fragments, but they have a smaller set that they take out on a rotating basis, and they image them as proxies for changes over time. And there's a number of sort of standard problems that the scrolls have. Some of them are darker, they get dark over time. Some of them have where the parchment is delaminating and it's coming apart. There's another set where the ink is for some reason starting to eat its way through the substrate, and so they're taking these and other problem children out and imaging them more frequently. I think every 6 to 8 months, and developing a database and using these for looking for changes. Another example that I want to talk about is some work we did and what we call bugs on stone, which is really biofilm on built heritage, like outdoor monuments or statues or buildings. And there's a whole raft of cyanobacteria and algae and biofilms that live on stone and damage it through metabolic byproducts. And then there's a whole group of what are called these endolithic communities that actually they extend millimeters, maybe 10, 15 millimeters into the stone, and they are a cascade of bacteria, where the bacteria further in live off metabolic byproducts from the guys that are above them, and all these are really pretty damaging. So you can separate bacteria, for example, using spectra, and you can't do for all of them, but for some of them, there's enough of a difference that I'm showing you some spectra here of a couple of different kind of bacteria, and this is a classified image. So we can get some information without having to do any kind of staining or assay looking at bacteria. So it offers a tool for figuring out what's going on the stone. But what I wanted to show you is this work. So this is biofilm. So this is data from the we did this at the Huntington Gardens here in Pasadena, and we used a prototype of an instrument called Sherlock, which is now on the 2020 Mars lander mission. It's been delivered to the Cape. But we had access to some of the early prototypes at JPL. And Sherlock is an instrument which is designed to look for biosignatures and biomarkers on Mars. And it has a couple different modes. The one I'm going to show you data from here is it's a spot instrument, it's a scanner, and it uses pretty deep UV excitation from a copper laser to excite fluorescence, and then it looks at the fluorescence spectrum. And we were able to get in. So this is a statue in what's called the Temple of Love, which is near the Rose Garden. And you'll see all this dark stuff on here is basically bacterial communities that are growing on the surface. Well, this is grime, but up here, this is the area that we scan. And right here, you see that the green fluorescence indicates microbial growth. On the right is a statue that had recently been cleaned. I don't know the cleaning methodology, but obviously you look here and you see that there's not any, there's no fluorescence. So this is a way to map out a big problem for built heritage, is to look for microbial communities. They're very damaging to the stones. And we also went to the Huntington. They have a boneyard where they have all these pieces of marble and stuff from various objects on there. And so here's a nice visible image. Here is a deep UV native fluorescence image. And you'll see that, obviously there's some bacterial growth on here. And then if you go and you try to classify this based on the spectral features, you can actually identify whether things are photosynthetic bacteria, if they're fungal, or they're bacterial. And so from people that are interested in figuring out ways to clean it or stop it or kill the bacteria, this is all very good information. So the last thing I want to talk about was, and Ross asked me to talk about this a little bit, which is something that was in the news recently with the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And it's not specifically spectral imaging per se, but it is related to imaging in the scrolls. And I just happen to know a lot about it because of my previous work. And so briefly, there were a number of Dead Sea Scroll fragments that came on the antiquities market, private dealers, about maybe 15 years ago. And a lot of people bought them because they just simply, there's very few pieces in private hands. And the biggest purchasers were the Museum of the Bible, which is run by the Green family from Hobby Lobby, and then a number of evangelical Christian colleges in the States. And at the time, when these things came on the market, there was a lot of discussions of whether or not these were actually forgeries or not. And the consensus at the time was that based on orthography and paleography, because those are pretty much the basic criteria that text scholars went by, that these were authentic. But what's happened since then, so it's been roughly 15, 17 years in terms of technology, is the kind of technologies that John has been doing, for example, can provide a lot of very detailed chemical information that wasn't available then. And so what the Museum of the Bible did was they hired a team to look at the scrolls, and they pulled out pretty much every technique you could find. There was microscopy, there was spectral imaging, there was FTIR, there was Raman, and the conclusion was that these are in fact inauthentic, which is the term of art now, and that they had been created specifically for and these people had all bought these fragments through roughly the same set of dealers. And John talked about what you learn about, fabrication and painting technologies, which is, very interesting. It helps you understand how these objects were created, at the same time how to curate them and conserve them. And that was one thing that they learned a great deal about from the Museum of the Bible study. I wasn't involved with the work, but I was asked to review the results and to be part of a small conference they had on this. But I think that, and I think John also mentioned too, the thing is that the people that fabricated these didn't have access to this information because it simply didn't exist. So when they did their best state-of-the-art forgeries, but technology, I think, sort of unmasked them. So I want to conclude with that is, the arc here is that we started out with spectral imaging and multiband imaging, looking for text and context clues, and the end result we wound up with was a methodology that's still in place to look for changes in the scrolls, and to then figure out, the big question is obviously, well, what do I do? But there's new work coming out to what's causing these kinds of changes in scrolls that help point them in the right direction. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank all presenters, and I wish to thank all listeners that are still online with us. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. I wish to continue by showing you the features of our hyperspectral systems, and I thought that the best way is to give you a couple of examples, of real examples of applications on artwork and similar applications as well. So I won't go through too much into the technical details of my technology overview, but very much into the application. The only thing that I want to mention to you is a bit about Headwall and the philosophy behind the products and the solutions. And I like this slide very much because it's also showing you a bit of a history of Headwall and how we've grown to the solutions that we have now. So just to start, remember that Headwall Photonics is the world's leading manufacturer of high efficiency diffractive optics. This means that probably Headwall is the only hyperspectral imaging producer that is also making its own gratings in-house. And gratings are the beating heart of a spectrograph, of a spectrometer system. Around this grating, we manufacture a patented aberration-corrected optical design which balances efficiency and quantum efficiency, and very important, is ruggedized and athermalized. And as John mentioned in this previous presentation, it's very small and compact, and is suitable for every environment. Finally, we wrap these products with a solution, which is a software, which gives you the capability to analyze collected data and obtain actionable solutions of data analysis. All these things together don't just make a product, but make up a complete solution. So coming to the real examples, I thought to give you two examples of the two main spectral ranges we sell and are used by researchers across the globe. The first application is in the Vernier. As you have heard previously, Vernier stands for visible NIR, and it ranges from 400 to 1000 nanometers. This system has been tested in the beautiful Abbey of San Miniato al Monte in Firenze, on a Politico, on a painting by Agnolo Gaddi, which stands in the grand altar of the church. This study has been conducted when the Politico was being restored, so dismounted and then remounted after the restoration, in cooperation with the Italian National Research Council, the Institute for the Science and of the Protection of Cultural Heritage, which I wish to thank heartfully. The field setup has been, when the painting had been dismounted, the field setup was that the system was brought into a dark room and illuminated, as you can see from the picture, by two halogen bulbs, and the camera, this very small and compact Vernier camera, has been mounted on a scanning gantry. The camera is a Vernier hyperspectral solution covering the, as I said, the 400,000 nanometer range with 270 spectral bands and 640 spatial pixels. The scanning gantry provided by the Research Council is very nice. I like it because it's got a very stable and consistent movement, moving the camera to scan in parallel to the sample at a constant speed. As you can see, the system is extremely compact, and we could easily mount it on a lightweight system such as this one you have seen. And regarding Vernier, okay, a lot of has been said before me and by big experts, much bigger than me experts previously. But I just wish to underline two main advantages of hyperspectral imaging. And the first is just hyperspectral. Hyperspectral means, as you can see from the image, that you can tell even very subtle changes of color, given by pigments, of course, on paintings. So if you look at, for instance, at the red and black arrows on the image, they are, at least to my eyes, not easily detectable, not easy to differentiate them. But hyperspectral can definitely give you a precise and accurate spectral profile of each color, even when differences are very, very subtle. And the other term is actually imaging. Hyperspectral adds the spatial dimension to analysis. So as much as my other presenters did previously, I did a map of the pigments which were on the painting by Agnolo Gaddi, and I could map the distribution of these pigments across the scene. So I'm actually adding a spatial dimension to the spectral information. This is not just single point analysis, but it's a spatial distribution of a property. It could be color, but it could be many other properties available by spectroscopy. The other application that I wanted to show you is an application in the SWIR. SWIR stands for shortwave infrared, and it spans from 900 to 2500 nanometers. The study has been conducted on a contemporary painting made of known materials, which has been kindly produced exactly for training and testing purposes. This painting is an oil paint painted on a canvas, which was itself covered with gesso. And this is the laboratory setup. I mentioned to you a field setup. This time I want to show you a laboratory setup. Laboratory setup, a complete laboratory setup must include a series of features that make the solution ready to use. First of all, the movement of the sample tray must be synchronized with the acquisition speed of the camera, with the frame rate of the camera. Secondly, and maybe of fundamental importance, is illumination. We provide a light bulb, a quartz tungsten halogen light, with a parabolic corrector that projects a linear light of a very homogeneous linear light on the sample. And this is of fundamental importance. This design of lighting is very homogeneous all across the width of the sample. The other thing I want to mention about this setup is that you can hold two cameras simultaneously. So you can imagine that you can cover, for example, the veneer and the sphere in a simultaneous measurement on the sample. And just to give you a bit of a figure, the sample tray is 1,297 by 997 millimeters. So actually, it can hold quite large samples. I don't need to say much more about SWIR data than what's been said previously. I just want to mention a fundamental difference from the veneer. When you measure with the SWIR, you are using molecular spectroscopy that reveals information about the chemical composition of samples. That's probably the thing that I wish to highlight more about SWIR versus the veneer range. And in specific, in the world of cultural heritage, in the world of oil painting, as you can, as the experts of you can see, these spectra show the typical spectral bands of oils and substrates. I don't want to assign each spectral band to a single molecular component, but what I want to highlight is that every spectrum is a fingerprint of the molecule you are studying. Other applications that SWIR, and not only the SWIR, but the veneer as well, can provide is to show hidden traits in paintings and in many other works of art. In the video that I'm showing you, you can see that I'm scrolling through bands, meaning that for each band, I'm printing out a grayscale image that shows you how, changing wavelengths, you can visualize the image and uncover hidden traits, such as you can see here, the pencil marks made by the painter before she completed the painting, before she painted the painting. This opens up a lot of applications, just to mention one, in forensic, in authentication, in studying hidden traits, something that the eyes can see. And another thing that I want to mention about the SWIR, talking about the other applications that you can do with your system, is that many other different materials can be characterized by the SWIR. For example, as you can see here, we've got spectra of gypsum, spectra of carbonates, and spectra of clays, just to mention three major minerals that respond to the SWIR. And just to add an organic compound, here's also a spectrum of wood. But all of you who are working with modern art will encounter more and more issues related to modern materials, such as plastics. And even plastics exhibit a very strong SWIR spectrum. So SWIR can be applied to a big variety of materials. And as I said, each material provides a unique fingerprint associated to the response to light in this spectral range. So to conclude, before we open the door to question and answers, which I hope will be many, I want to highlight that the hyperspectral imaging technique adds the spatial dimension to spectral analysis, as I showed you in the example. And accurate spectral profiles with high resolution, for example, in the veneer, can detect subtle differences of color given by different pigments. The SWIR range collects the spectral fingerprint, the unique spectral fingerprint of many different organic and inorganic materials. And finally, hyperspectral imaging is a useful technique to uncover hidden traits. For example, it could be that it's useful to assess the authenticity of a work of art or bring light into darker areas of a painting. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll pass the ball to our marketing director, Ross, for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Francesco. I'm going to work somewhat in reverse, and I'm going to ask questions of the individual speakers. We did have a lot of questions, so bear with me as I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. We won't get to all, but I'm going to start with a question, a very good question, asking, and I'm going to address this to Francesco because Headwall does this a lot. Can you describe some issues or experiences co-registering veneer and SWIR when trying to maintain pixel-to-pixel integrity? This person is doing some imaging that is not necessarily art related, it's biological, but this applies to all kinds of imaging.
Yeah, there are ways that you can, first of all, there are ways that you can configure a veneer and the SWIR system to see more or less the same FOV, to have the same FOV field of view and pixel size, single pixel size. But basically, co-registration is a tough thing to run and something we evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Let's say that we don't consider that as an off-the-shelf solution because we think it's too big of a promise to make, but we prefer to work on a case-by-case basis. It's possible, but there's always a compromise between the benefit of co-registering and the information you sacrifice. So it's got to be studied on a case-by-case basis.
This is John Delaney. Can I jump in make a comment?
Of course, of course.
Yes, this is it's a very important question because it's very hard to find, unless you design the system to have the features that Francesco is mentioning, you have to sort of face this problem separately. We have written software with George Washington University that uses the technique where we have a reference image. In this case, we usually have like a color image. We register the veneer cube, one of the bands in the veneer cube, to the color image, transfer all the bands, do the same thing for the SWIR, and then we're able to combine the images together. It works pretty well, and then we have another technique to merge the spectral domain. That's how we've solved that problem. We analyzed quite a few cubes with both the visible and the SWIR data.
Thank you.
And there's a related question by somebody who's also familiar with airborne imaging. Are there such things equivalent to ground control points that would help with registering the data? And that would be for all three of you.
Oh, yeah. So the algorithms that we developed were, there are plenty of excellent algorithms for registration. The shift method that was brought up earlier by Greg is obviously a very popular one. The problem we find is that as you go into the SWIR, a lot of objects that you can see in the visible fade away and new objects appear. You also have the problem that unlike flying and taking pictures of trees whose contrast will change in the visible and the SWIR, but you still have an object in the same place, your tree can disappear, turn into a person, shift to the right. So what we did was to come up with an algorithm, this is published, which is based on wavelets, and we do a wavelet decomposition, keeping a certain range of wavelets that relate to spatial frequency features common to all the modalities in order to do the registration part.
And another question, and this would be for John and Greg. First, John, is there an ultimate goal for this type of imaging?
In terms of paintings, yes, the ultimate goal is essentially there are two objectives. One is the conservation of the work of art. I mean, these works of art are very important. They belong to humanity in a way, and their preservation is critical. And I think that Greg underscored the importance of the efforts necessary to make sure that they are maintained in ideal conditions. There's a lot of interest about materials that are used. Sometimes the materials used in the restoration early on to get rid of or remove materials that are unstable, to look at degradation products over time. And the problem is that while we have excellent tools for sampling, to answer all the questions, there is a reluctance and an inability to sample just anywhere in the painting. So that's the goal of these type of tools, and they're on the horizon. They will continue to improve. We are adapting from instrumentation that's been very successful in remote sensing in many, many different fields in industrial monitoring.
Greg, any comment on ultimate goals?
Well, I think that I think various people in this field have divergent interests. One of the things I think that's important is to be able to develop tools and software that people can use without having to have, a postdoc and 3 PhDs and I think market forces certainly for cameras and software is pushing in that direction. But the problem is there's so much of this stuff that is in danger that it would be just a colossal problem to figure out a way to address it without some uptick in lowering the cost and availability, increasing the availability of the technology and the software.
And we have many questions that are closely related about illuminating the paintings and drawings and text, especially using high energy wavelengths, such as those used for some fluorescence imaging. What kind of precautions are taken to prevent damage to art and antiquities? First, John, and then Greg.
Okay.
In the case of our work, we follow under the guidelines from the American Institute of Conservation, which guide that our light levels can have to be below 2,000 lux for imaging for tens of minutes. So we essentially adjust our cameras to work under those conditions. We're able to get down to about 700 lux for the case when we're looking at illuminated manuscripts, which get us into a range that it's equivalent light level that you'd see, the painting will see just in the studio. In the case of fluorescence, the excitation light is more intense. We generally use a line for that type of excitation work, but again, the light levels are about 5,000 lux, and it's not much different than what people use under the microscope to look at the work of art. So we try to stay under that, under those conditions.
Greg?
Yeah, that's a perennial question. We solved it, at least for the scroll project, by going to LEDs. And they don't have a thermal component to it the way a lot of other lights do. There are CIE standards, which I think are reflected, so to speak, into the AIC on illumination values. But a lot of the data certainly that exists for, a lot of the recommendations that exist for parchment papyrus are really kind of more guesses because there really isn't a lot of data. I mean, I have some data myself that I did using a microfader, and certainly it turned out for the scrolls that they're really incredibly robust. But for paintings and illuminated manuscripts that have pigments that may, you know, be very fugitive and sensitive to photo bleaching, yeah, it's a really big problem. And I'm sure John's had the same experience I do, which you know, you talk to people and I'm going to do this, this, this. Then when you show up and they say, what are you going to do? And because they didn't really quite make the connection between what I said I was going to do and then when they actually see the image and go ahead.
Yeah, that's why it's actually good that the American Institute of Conservation and other groups have established standards based on microfading, which is a technique, which is a relatively standard way to determine the light sensitivity of objects. So I think that's all pretty good. There's actually some limits on thermal heating, how much you can warm up an object. Getting rid of the UV light, getting rid of the thermal light is very important. We typically use Solex lamps that are optimized for illuminating paintings for this reason, and also being cautious. The way you get around this problem is by working with state-of-the-art sensitive focal planes, which have allowed people to look at the fluorescence emission spectrum from a single fluorescent molecule and track it over time for chemists. So we live in an age where these spectrometers can be coupled to super sensitive focal planes that are not outrageously expensive, that allow us to work under safe conditions. But it is true, as Greg's mentioning, you do have to work with a conservator. Each object is different. Some objects can take more light than others, and yeah, do best practice.
So we have a lot of questions that have specific technique questions, which I think we can answer offline. I'm going to have one more question before we close out. I want to thank everybody for attending. One high-level question is first to John, then to Greg. What role do you see artificial intelligence, for example, machine learning, deep learning, to aid data processing and analysis?
That is a very, very good question. There have been a few papers out there which has begun to look at there's two components, right? So Greg and I have been stressing the spectral dimension of the data set. There's also the spatial dimension of the data set. That's because these are pictures that are very interesting. There's there's some initial work going into using artificial intelligence to exploit the spatial information and how things are different and similar among artists in the spatial domain. Trying to work with the spectral data set's a different story. In remote sensing, there has been a fair amount of analysis on the use of spectral algorithms that are neural network centered to improve the probability of identification or matching a particular n-member spectra to a database, and therefore classifying data cubes and going from like 80% to 90%. So that's an area that still holds promise.
And Greg?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of it as well. Yeah, as John said, there's been some work recently, and there were some at Whispers, I think, whenever the heck that was, on using various kinds of machine learning and AI. There's been some work on teaching it to recognize text, which is a little different than the problem we're talking about now.
That's a good idea.
I think the issue is I think the problem is going to be like it is getting training sets that you can use. And
yeah, that's a good thing. Training sets. One of the problems we have is that although we have a lot of paintings by a given artist, every work is kind of different, and we don't have millions of images by Van Gogh. We have a subset. We only have in the 20s for Vermeer. So we're really data starved compared to a lot of neural network analysis techniques. Would you agree, Greg?
Yeah. I mean, they're used to using literally millions of images. And the other thing is that also, if you can use a training set, you have to give it already analyzed and classified data so it knows what it's doing. And that's a big chunk of work all by itself. And so I think that people are going to continue doing it because it's an obvious thing to try out. But I don't know. It's easier for remote sensing, right? Because there are all these sites that everybody flies over and looks at, and there's a lot of ground truth to go with it. So you have ways of training it. But you know, the problem with AI in general, of course, is that you train it on data set A, and then when you look at something that is a little different, it just flops. So you know, a limited amount of paintings and things like that. I'm not sure how well it would work out in practice.
There is, I must say, there is an interesting paper that was published in Science Advances in the last year on a special edition on cultural heritage, where authors worked on a machine learning algorithm to solve a particularly gnarly problem. If you have a panel painting, and this occurs fairly often, where you have a painting on either side, and you do an X-ray, you of course get the X-ray of both sides together. The conservators are desperate to have an X-ray image of just each part separately, each surface separately. And this particular paper demonstrated an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, using color images, the X-ray image, that they can actually separate that out. So that's a case where that's a very important tool for people, where they made some good progress. So I guess creative people will come up with solutions. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and because this is a very active field, there will be lots of people, generation after generation, working on this. I'm going to ask Francesco to say a few words in closing before we close out the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Before I close, I'd like to answer very quickly on the question about illumination, which, needless to say, is fundamental. And I want to say that it reminded me of what we did at the Rijksmuseum when, for matters of safety of the painting, light was very dim. And the answers by John and Greg have been in regards to the safety of the environment and the painting. But I can say something on the side of the spectrometer and say that what matters is to have, as we provided it, a system that has a high dynamic range, and you can play with the frame rate of the camera to still collect a decent, or a more than a decent, a very good signal out of a sample which is very lightly illuminated by the bulbs, meaning that you can keep the painting safe, and you can keep the environment safe and the operators as well, but you can still collect a very good signal. And that reminded me, as I said, of what we did in Amp. So just to close, I wish to thank John, Delaney, and Greg Bearman for their lectures and for their answers to questions. I wish to thank all participants. It's been one of the most attended webinars we've ever made. And I personally find this application so intriguing and so interesting that I'm happy that so many people attended and listened to our presentation. I wish to thank Don Battistoni, the VP of Sales and Marketing at Headwall, for introducing the webinar, and Ross Nakatsuji, our Marcom Director, for moderating all this. I know it's difficult times, and I wish everyone to stay healthy and safe. And until the next time, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.